Okay, let's look at this command magazine Chaco War. So, this is one of those games that it just didn't really do it for me. I don't usually stop things midway, even though the outcome was fairly certain here. But I was, maybe playing a turn or two a day and just not able to bring myself to keep playing. The outcome largely was predetermined by the point I stopped. I think as a simulation, it is fairly good. Trying to remember, there were some things that felt a little wonky surrounding the leaders. When you could, when you could set up an attack, when you couldn't, etc. I think especially the fact that you could have major failures with underlings, and it didn't reflect poorly either on the commanding officer or on the underlings. So if, like in the game that I played, you ended up with the best leaders that you wanted, you never had to actually try to replace anyone. Granted, Bolivia never, in my game, had made an attempt to replace their commander-in-chief, but in a sense, the commander, there were many worse leaders that could come into play because of a promotion from the ranks. So getting rid of the commander-in-chief voluntarily didn't seem like a good idea. The only way that you're ever forced to replace a leader is if the commander-in-chief takes really serious losses. And I don't think I ever hit that case. Largely because I was avoiding putting my commander in place. Yeah, you have to take at least 50% losses with your commander-in-chief. So the bad commander-in-chief was never really at risk. And Paraguay's commander is the best guy in the game to begin with. So I didn't want to replace him ever. And he was lucky enough to be in a position that he never got, totally hosed over in a defensive position. That's the other thing. You seldom are going to take a potential loss as the attacker that'll force you into that situation, just because of the way the combat chart is designed. On a one-to-one attack on a 1, you'd get the result as the attacker that could force you to replace your commanding officer. Outside of that, so the game had a heavy focus on the supply side of things. And it did try to lessen the burden of supply compared to, say, an OCS type game where you're constantly shuttling your supply forward. But I've actually found the requirements you're not required to have supply in the hexes that you're fighting in, but it seems a very good idea to keep a supply unit or two in each of your frontline hexes, just in case it gets cut off, in case it ends up in a terrible position. And some of that has to do with the reaction movement, which adds greatly to the headache in this game. The combination of the supply effort and the reaction movement make the game very difficult. So supply is pretty easy to set up as long as the weather is good. But when you get to the rain weather, your roads are useless and supply just becomes a nightmare. And it really becomes a nightmare. Now, I was able to, towards the end of the game, set up my supply correctly and wasn't as badly affected by it as I should be. But like I mentioned this in some of the playthroughs, this reminds me a lot of the Desert Fox. In terms of the amount of effort you have to put into the supply, the amount of effort you have to put into figuring out your attacks, etc. So I'm spending the kind of time that I would in, I don't know, at least a CWB game. Yet most of that time is spent counting factors and trying to make sure that my line is positioned and spread out correctly. Kind of reminds me of Der Weltkrieg that way. Trying to make sure that I don't have any defects in my line. Just, you know, all these decisions that some people might really enjoy, but for me, they just kind of add up to one big headache. Counting the supply distances, counting whether or not I have enough supplies to conduct the offensive that I want. None of it can really be done by gut. It's all pretty much available to you to calculate in advance. And games that require, you know, to play well, that you do a lot of calculation in advance, just kind of irk me. So I love the Desert Fox, supposedly, right? It's a headache too, but the difference here is really a matter of the topic. It's not that it's impossible that there are drives across the map. You saw in my first few months of the game, Paraguay got a huge gain of territory early on. They overextended themselves, there's no question. And in fact, they were able to do that because Bolivia extended itself. But like Desert Fox, this is a game where if you can create a fairly solid barrier, the opponent is not going to be able to easily circumvent that. In Desert Fox, there are locations that are good for a defensive line. But here, pretty much the whole map can serve as one as long as you have the correct roadway. Which means that if you've got a proper follow-up to your advances and you don't try to push too hard, you probably shouldn't see the kind of wild swings that we saw early in the game. Which means it comes down to this kind of boring, you know, fight over not a lot of distance and control of these vital roadways, etc. And I'm neither saying that that's not realistic. I think it is very realistic. I think the game actually plays out pretty nicely. Nor would that be no fun for anyone, but for me, it just added up to this horrible calculating nightmare. There are certainly interesting decisions and risk profiles that you could present towards how you want to approach this game, and I can see a lot of that being actually really enjoyable to some players. On the other hand, it kind of feels like a World War I type situation, and World War I situations have never been terribly popular among most people, so it's probably not for many people. In particular, the optional rules for Barrage, well, that's not so bad. Barrage is kind of neat because it's this kind of luck type element where, you know, you can make your attack a lot easier by blowing or spoil the other guy's attack with a few lucky die rolls. The Cav optional rule, though, is really kind of a pain in the ass. And it's kind of strange. So here's the thing, that I think the game is designed for the Cav optional rule in mind. If you play without the Cav optional rule, which, as I said, you have to hunt through all your pieces or else know where all your Cav is, so that you can roll for attrition against them. Because even if they're in supply, they have the potential of being affected by attrition. If you're not playing with the Cav optional rule, I think the Cav becomes a little too potent, especially the Bolivian Cav. It's very heavy on strength points, and if you don't have the weaknesses of having to match that to infantry and of Cav being kind of fragile, at least to attrition, you're going to probably be able to use those to tremendous effect. Component-wise, I guess we'll blather to that for a bit. There's a bit of slickness to the map, which causes some problems when it's combined with the glossy counters. The glossy counters are somewhat unimaginative. They're serviceable. If they were matte, I'd be tickled pink by them. Obviously, they wouldn't have so many colors, I guess, because for some reason map counters never have many colors. These little stars that I had to stick to the map, those are kind of a negative in my view. There should be some indication of the towns that have an additional cost in terms of victory points. The fact that the middle of the rule book is a non-removable, because there's rules on the other side, player aid charts, is kind of annoying. I had to photocopy them, and then in addition to that, which is a mild annoyance, but you know, at least I have a photocopier available to me now. It also ends up impeding the actual ability to investigate the rules. So I'd rather that they put something that was removable in with a couple advertisements on it or something. There's also other player aids that could have been useful that were not provided, such as the sequence of play, which is kind of, you know, annoying because this isn't a trivial sequence of play. In particular, I was finding myself regularly forgetting to make the truce check, which could have been very important at certain points. I kind of made up for it, but the sequence itself, well, weather is simply a fixed occurrence, which I mentioned in one of the early videos. Kind of bothered me. I felt like there should be some variance to the weather. There is a lot of randomness in the game, in the sense of when you're rolling on the supply table. This can be a major effect on the game in terms of not, to some extent, how much supplies you get, but also how many replacement points you get. So this is a pretty major influence on the course of play, both factors. And those are determined by a die roll. You have some influence in terms of how far ahead of your main supply source you are, and in terms of how good your commander is and whether or not he's with the headquarters. The terrain effects chart changes completely depending on the weather. That's why supply becomes a nightmare there. So the weather is a huge factor in this game. The truce check. So this was kind of interesting. Throughout my game, for much of the game, maybe a year, maybe half of what I played, maybe a third of the game overall, if you look at it, if I played the whole thing. Paraguay was in a position where they could win an automatic victory on a 1 in 18 chance. That's a pretty damn big luck factor in the game. I could see discarding the truce rules, maybe giving Paraguay some victory point boost at some point if they've gotten to a certain point, just to get rid of that, because some people don't like that kind of luck effect. I don't mind it much. I was kind of hoping the game would end that way. Or there would at least be a truce so I wouldn't have to play so many turns, because the turns, especially the good weather turns, are really a headache. You're constantly getting a supply of supply units, replacement points, and reinforcements throughout the game. The reinforcements just come from your dead pile. There's kind of something weird there in that if you've got all your units on the board, you're not going to be replacing those units, but you don't get any bonus to your replacement points or anything like that. That feels a little off to me. The whole reaction movement system, I think it works well as a simulation there, but boy does it create a big pain in the ass in terms of the amount of thought you have to put into your positioning each turn. Again, I could see people really liking that, but for me it was simply a headache. There's an interesting little combat situation in it, which is after the reactive player gets to reaction move, then both players get to declare combats. First the phasing player, then the reactive player, then the phasing player again. And what that means is that the reactive player has a chance to disrupt an attack as it's in progress. It will often be the case that you can't force the defender to retreat on the first roll, and you're still set up for an attack. Every now and then you might get a follow-through attack, but that's really unlikely given sort of optimal setups defensively. And you have engineering work, not all of which I did. I didn't build a single well with Paraguay's units. I could never keep up, keep my engineers up to the point where they needed to build a well. And there was sufficient water. Usually entrenching became the more important thing. And there just weren't enough engineers for Paraguay to be able to say, yeah, I can afford to build a well here. That may have had something more to do with the style of play, the fact that things were so fluid early, but also due to the lack of engineers in general, that wasn't an option. Same thing happened with clearing terrain. I had times when I wanted to clear terrain, but I never actually did it because when an offensive was underway, I found that I just couldn't keep up with the offensive with my engineers in order to do that. I think it would be a seldom used thing. There's a lot of counters for clearing terrain, which is kind of sad because there aren't quite enough supply counters. But maybe some players cleared a lot of terrain. You could use blanks for clearing terrain for all I care. What else do we have? Yeah, I think the heart of it is sort of that reaction movement in combat, which is very interesting. There's no question there. And it's, again, kind of reminiscent of Desert Fox's reaction movement, except here it's focused on the leaders. You can only do it if you have a leader present. And your leaders are vital to your supply lines, actually, at least your forward supply lines. You're able to kind of wind a rear supply line, and I never had a problem with my rear supply lines. Those just kind of take care of themselves. You might find that you're spending extra hexes to fill them out, but for the most part, I was able to keep those in line pretty well. Only had to make a couple of attrition rolls due to being out of supply for the rear supply lines. But the forward supply lines were really problematic, especially when bad weather came. And if you don't have, in good weather, if you don't have the road lines, sort of the parallel to the advance lines, it's going to be very hard to keep your road network moving forward, because what you want to do is you want to position your main headquarters on that parallel road, just slightly behind your forward advance. And what that meant is that there's certain places that are easier to advance than others. So for example, wherever there's a parallel road, and there aren't a hell of a lot of them, most of them are going to be perpendicular to your advance, wherever there's a parallel road, you could set up a good defensive line ahead of that, or a good attack going forward from that. But it's really hard anywhere else. You become driven to only using the road network itself for the advances. And again, it's all very interesting. Like the actual mechanics or mechanisms in play in the game and how they react with the terrain. It all is very, very intriguing. If it weren't for the headache factor, or if there was just a little bit more action going on, it would feel worth the effort. But as it is, it just leaves me feeling dry, more because of the nature of the subject matter than anything else. And that's kind of a shame. Usually I'm really interested in games that don't succeed, don't really follow the normal mold. But this just didn't hook me the way, say, I don't know, the way an OCS game would, or some other supply-based games kind of do. It felt just a little too dry for me, a little too much effort to play. What about the magazine itself? This was actually very pleasing to me. It may be because of out of the ordinary war that it covered as its, headlining piece. A lot of information on the war, maybe more than I like, but if you want to know about the military operations in this war, this is probably a pretty damn good place to get them from. It really pleased me compared to most magazine coverage in terms of the detail that it went into. The other issues in here, the other articles in here, a nice kind of flavor piece, an interview with a World War I veteran, which I found kind of interesting to read. The DLM, I find this a neat segment because it helps you to play the game. It gives you ideas about the game, sort of like a player's note in most. And it's got the designer's notes as well in it. What do we got here? An article on the U.S. Naval Airship Program, which I remember also enjoying. Other than the main article, I got a lot out of the little articles. One thing, though, is this game really focuses heavily. Here's a short one on Spanish-American War, the naval threat that Spain provided. Little piece on the Grant tank, and then some bookkeeping just about the magazine itself. Not a lot of that. I think the thing that's kind of interesting is that this really focused. You're buying the game and a magazine about the game. It's not like an S&T that gives you, even if you're not interested in the subject matter at all, it gives you a lot of information about a lot of other things. This pretty much is very heavily focused on the game that you're getting. Personally, I like that. I buy these gaming magazines for the games and for knowledge about the subject matter that the game is covering. So it feels more like a good boxed game with a playbook and some designer's notes and player's notes in it, and quite a decent historical article as well, all of which combines to something that I really prefer to, articles about stuff that have nothing to do with the topic that the game covers. And it also means if you buy things individually, you're getting something that you're interested in. If you have the subscription and you don't like, not that you can get a subscription to Command Magazine anymore, but if you didn't like the topic that the game covered, well, you've wasted a whole magazine's worth in that case. But, I pick them up used for the games that I like. Another thing, though, that I'm a little iffier about is there's some replacement counters, none of which are useful to me at this point, but I might pick up Hugomont. You've heard good things about it. And maybe some of the others. The other one's a Greek one that I'm interested in. That gives you, probably errata that came out, for the counters that you could probably find online and mark up your counters if need be. So the disadvantage to that, which I mentioned in the intro, is the game itself doesn't tell you on the counter sheet in this magazine, in the rules, anywhere, what those counters are for. I had to look on an online resource to find out what they're for. And, that was kind of cool. It wasn't for this magazine that it told me about them. It was for the prior magazines. In those, it told me what magazine I need to get those excess counters. Well, that cut off rather abruptly. Apparently, my power is being problematic again. And I just totally ran out of power. I don't have much more to say. I just didn't want the abrupt cutoff. I know that bothers some people. So, ciao.